Okay, I believe class has started. Seems like this happens. I'm always afraid when we begin that it's just going to be the 10 of us or something. We usually get a few more trickling in. I'm going to say the rain's keeping people back tonight to some degree. But we'll go ahead and jump in, and we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 tonight. We'll do a little bit of review of the book as a whole, and specifically reviewing a little bit more in depth from chapter 10, where we were last week. So I'll be counting on you guys to remember some things from the book so far. So let's go through the outline. We've broken up 2 Corinthians into 3 sections. The first section, chapters 1 to 7, Paul is describing his blank. What is Paul describing in the first 7 chapters? His ministry, okay? What do you remember? We don't go into a lot of detail, but what are some of the things Paul is talking about in chapters 1 to 7 as he's describing his ministry? He gives thanks in the first part of chapter 1. Gives thanks for what, Muffy? Yeah, for them, for the Corinthians, for the comfort that God has given to Paul and his companions that he's able to share also with the Corinthians, which becomes a big deal later on. What does Paul say about his own work? His own... What did he say? It's not about him, right? When he gets into the heart of talking about his role as a minister of the gospel, it's very clear. He uses lots of different images, right, to basically make the same point, which is what Robert says, that it's not about him. And in the midst of that, he is also giving a report on his travel. And maybe some of that will come up as we talk about what Paul's doing in this last part of the book. But he reports on where he's been, where he's going, and talks about his ministry in the gospel, and then concludes in chapter 7 with that final report that he got from Titus as he's traveling along the way to see the Corinthians. A good report that the Corinthians are receptive of Paul's message and are willing to listen and to change. Okay, so next part of the book, chapters 8 and 9, Paul is encouraging what? The giving or the contribution. And that contribution is for whom? I think I said that right. Needy saints where? In Jerusalem. Okay, so Paul is collecting money from churches in Macedonia and Achaia, where Corinth is, to take to the needy saints in Judea and Jerusalem. And then finally, in this last part of the book, chapters 10 to 13, Paul is addressing who or whom? His opponents, okay? So this is what we're going to talk a little bit more, because we started into this in chapter 10, and we'll pick up here in chapter 11. Paul is, as we've said, addressing his opponents. So there's 3 basic questions that we kind of talked about last week that we'll start with as we review chapter 10, and these answers really apply to chapters 11, 12, and 13 as well. But let's see what we remember from last week. Who are Paul's opponents? What do you remember about these people that are opposed to Paul, that he's having to address in these chapters? They're mean. They're power hungry, Robert says. And they have a personal vendetta against Paul. What else do you remember about these opponents? I'll ask you this. Are Paul's opponents folks inside the church of Corinth or outside the church of Corinth? Outside, okay? And what is the nature of their teaching or their aims or goals? They're Judaizers. What does that mean, Muffy, that they're Judaizers? Hard to put you on the spot. Right. They are, yes, they don't like that Paul is teaching, as Muffy's saying, that all are saved in Christ, okay, and that Gentiles, don't have to become Jews, they don't have to be circumcised primarily to become Christians. That's Paul's message. It's the message of books like Romans and Galatians. These Judaizers don't like that. They put a special emphasis on being Jewish. They emphasize the customs of the law of Moses, and they would say that Gentiles need to be circumcised and other things in order to, be in this covenant people with Jesus. Okay, that's the best we can tell who these opponents are. Now, the question was a little bit of a trick question, because I think, yes, the opponents are outside the church at Corinth, but I do think there's a number inside the church that are maybe susceptible to going along with that doctrine or are being influenced by that outside group of false teachers. Are you with me? Okay. So the opponents, I think, are outside, but Paul's concern is that a group of Christians within the church at Corinth, and maybe a larger group if he's doesn't do his job effectively, will be swayed by these opponents. Okay, but we'll talk more about that as we go. We've alluded to some of this already. What is their beef with Paul? So we talked about the doctrine. There's probably a doctrinal conflict with the nature of salvation for Gentiles especially. But what other things did these opponents have against Paul? Some of the things they said about him, or what's wrong with the way he looks, Mike? Okay. Yes, his personal presence, Paul alludes to this in chapter 10, is not forceful, as his letters come across to be. And so they like to dismiss Paul because of his lack of maybe power in person, or maybe even his eloquence. Okay, again, I think there's probably more we'll add to that as we go tonight. Yes, Mike. I don't know. You tell me. Amen, Mike. I just commend to you everything Mike just said. I was thinking about some of that last week as well. That there's been people I've known and heard that, man, the things that they say are just biblical and wonderful and encouraging, but their delivery isn't all that great. And people walk away thinking, oh, that was a sorry sermon, or I don't like that preacher, whatever. That's kind of the flip side of the example Mike's giving of someone who is real engaging, wraps you in with his kind of charisma as a preacher, but is not saying anything or is saying something that's unbiblical. And both of those are symptoms of perhaps the same problem. Albert, you want to jump in on that, and then we'll move on?
Challenge that we have, now I'll lower my volume. The challenge we have with our own selves, by what authority? It seems that they're upset at Paul that he's trying to decentralize the authority, whereas it was all out of Jerusalem, and he's going up in these independent congregations, and then they're challenging him, or they're challenging others to say, how is it he could come to you and set these things up? By whose authority? So it's the same challenge that we have with ourselves in asking by whose authority. I had asked that when I was a Catholic, and I just feel like they're fighting. That's the battle that they're upset about, and that's what they're fighting about.
Yeah. Thank you, Albert. And be looking for that, especially in chapter 11, because we've already seen this. Albert's pointing it out, that yes, Paul's apostolic authority is in question here. And so he's having to defend his authority. Yes, he's not Peter or John, one of the original, but yet he's still an apostle and is defending that because that is the basis for the authority of his teaching. And that is also a nice lead into our third question, which we talked some about also last week, which is Paul's response or his defense. And maybe we'll leave this question open just to think about this as we go instead of talking about it all right now. But remember, what we've seen so far is that Paul is talking about himself, but it's really not ultimately about himself. And look for that as the tension in chapter 11, okay? So Robert said earlier that Paul's message in 2 Corinthians is that it's not about me. And yet, because of these opponents, Paul is put in a very difficult spot where he has to talk a lot about him, okay? So notice in chapter 11 how Paul is going to be talking a lot about himself while still trying to get across the message that, hey, it's not about me as a minister of the gospel, okay? Steve, last word on that, then we'll read chapter 11.
What did they think about him whenever he was a persecutor of Christ? I mean, did he have the same body, or was he like a bodybuilder at that time or something like that? People are fickle, okay? They're just absolutely fickle. And the fact is that he was every bit as eloquent or uneloquent then as he is now. So I think we need to maybe garner something from that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've wondered about that. Did Paul change his approach? He was the same guy. It's interesting. Maybe the stoning took its toll on him, right? It wasn't the same. So, I mean, we're going to read here this list. I mean, you would think maybe that some of this stuff took a physical effect on him that he went through. But let's jump in, and all of these questions are still going to be relevant as we read chapter 11. But let's read it, and then we'll spend our allotted time, as we've been doing in this class, just observing the text and then interpreting some and then making application at the end. But let's read all of 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul says, "I wish that you would bear with me in a little foolishness, but indeed you are bearing with me. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. For I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. But I am afraid that, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. For if one comes and preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit, which you have not received, or a different gospel, which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. For I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles, but even if I am unskilled in speech, yet I am not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way, we have made this evident to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need in everything. I kept myself from being a burden to you and will continue to do so. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. But what I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds. Again I say, let no one think me foolish, but if you do, receive me even as foolish, so that I also may boast a little. What I am saying, I am not saying as the Lord would, but as in foolishness, in this confidence of boasting. Since many boast according to the flesh, I will boast also. For you, being so wise, tolerate the foolish gladly. For you tolerate it if anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face. To my shame, I must say that we have been weak by comparison. But in whatever respect anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness. I am just as bold myself. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, and far more labors, far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. And apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? If I have to boast, I will boast of what pertains to my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the ethnarch under Aretas, the king, was guarding the city of the Damascenes in order to seize me, and I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall, and so escaped his hands. Okay, I'm set the timer for 10 minutes here to keep us on track. But let's start as we have been, just with observations. So we're not trying to analyze too much here, not trying to, answer the tough questions. Just what do we see? What stands out to you? What do you observe in 2 Corinthians 11? And please feel free to ask any questions you have from our reading of 2 Corinthians 11. Yeah, Mike, what do you got? Yeah. It's weird. That's a great observation, Mike. And that's the exact kind of thing we want to do when we're, observing it. If you think it's weird, just say it's weird and then try to figure out why it's weird. And Mike has explained well why it just stands out as being odd. So much talk about Paul and himself and what he has done, which seems counter to what we see in other places. Other observations, things that stand out to you. Okay, so Dan observes that there's, in terms of what's going on, Paul is preaching to the Corinthians without taking his wages from them. Now, he is taking money from other people, but not from them. And so that's something going on here. And again, that's just a piece of the puzzle we'll put in front of us. Someone else was speaking up over here. Yeah, Michelle. Were there any harsh words that stood out to you, Michelle? Yes, this servants of Satan. I've never called anybody that before. That's a harsh word, I think. So strong words, Michelle says, for the false teachers in chapter 11. Good. What else stands out? These are just things we're noticing in front of us here. Yeah, Beth.
Notice like the theme of like Satan and like his deception. That we could be deceived. Eve was deceived. These, false apostles were being deceived, or were deceiving people. Just kind of that was a repeated theme I saw.
Okay, so Satan and deception being a repeated idea starting in chapter 11, verse 3, with the reference to the serpent and Eve, and then later on where Michelle was taking us with Satan again in verse 14, disguising, deceiving, all of that. Other things that stand out to you? Yeah, Mike.
Word interpretations in New International Version. It's got in 8, I robbed other churches by receiving. To me, that robbed is one of those words that kind of jumps out at you also. What are some other words that are used in different interpretations? I'm asking anybody.
Yeah. In verse 8, so this is a good question. The word robbed, I robbed other churches. Does anybody's Bible, now if everybody's using the booklet, then we're going to go wrong here. I think that says robbed. But other Bibles, I know are using Bibles. Any other words beside robbed in verse 8? So that's the question I'm going to. Yeah. And that's the question I'll put down. Again, we can't answer. We're legally bound not to answer any questions until my timer goes off. Okay. That's the question. I think the answer to your first question is they probably all say robbed. As far as I understand, that word's used other places. That's exactly what that word means. It means robbed. But what is that? Why does he use that word? That's the question we'll want to write down and maybe come back to later. Good. Yeah, Michael.
I notice there's a lot of times he uses the word tolerate. Like, I guess, for instance, you tolerate the foolish gladly, verses 19. You tolerate it if anyone enslaves you. So he's talking about what the Corinthians are tolerating. It's an important thing to pay attention to.
Good. Tolerating, the theme of the Corinthians, tolerating Paul, or asking them to tolerate him, them tolerating the false teachers. Another thing. What about questions? We're the back end of our time here. So other questions you have? Albert, you have a question?
Just curious, in 31, I haven't taken the time to, how strong of was it a language that would cause the old Jewish folks to take a step back and deep breath, like, may God be my witness, but said the strongest words possible for that, or is he, I'm curious what's being said in 31 and how intense of the words he used or chose to use.
Okay. Okay, good question. Michael, you had a question?
Oh, no. I had an observation. That's not a question.
No, that's great. That's good too.
Okay. I noticed, so Beth had mentioned there was deceiving and false gospel and that kind of stuff, but there's also talk about sincerity. So there's like a contrast going on. And purity. Pure virgin to Christ, pure devotion. Those two kind of go together. If you're pure, you're sincere. You're pure in motive.
Right.
Betrothed in verse 2. What would that bring on?
Okay. Why talk about betrothed in verse 2?
A different translation, I kind of like it because it seems a little snarky to me, but he calls them super apostles. And so I think that might be worth discussing.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's in verse 5, right? Okay, yeah, the super apostles is, like, if you're using the English Standard, I think that's the phrase it uses, as opposed to Paul saying he's not inferior to the most eminent apostles. So we can look at that. We got 2 more minutes if we need it. Observations, questions, things that stand out, weird things. Everyone's trying to remember what their car alarm sounds like. If everyone hits their panic button, then we'll. Yeah, Michael.
I have a question. Why did well, I guess Paul didn't end the chapter, but why did they end the chapter? And if you start the next chapter, it makes sense that they ended the chapter here, but like, it just seems a very strange end to this section when you read the end of this. And he really does, in the next chapter, just move on to something else. So why is it written that way?
And just to clarify, because I actually think I'm thinking the same thing you are. You mean like he's kind of wrapping up, and then he refers to this story of being let down out of the wall, and then that's just it. Like he just mentions that. Yeah, I had the same question. That's kind of an odd way to do that. But yeah, we can talk about that. Okay, well that's good. Let's move on. Let's do the next 10 minutes or so trying to analyze and interpret some here. I'll just put all these up here because this is what we do in this section in interpretations. Let's try to make some connections, try to understand how these things fit together, and see what the main point of this chapter is. Let's start with some of the things y'all brought up about the kind of maybe working from beginning to end here in the chapter. The contrast between the purity, and he talks about them as a betrothed in the early verses of this chapter, and that contrast with the deception and the language about Satan and Eve, and then that will come up later with the false teachers as well, being deceptive. Let's kind of start with that. What's Paul really concerned about here in this chapter? How would you describe Paul's concern? Again, keeping in mind those themes of sincere devotion, like a pure betrothed bride, and the kind of deceitful workers of Satan. What's Paul concerned about in 2 Corinthians 11? Concerned that they'll fall away to another gospel, to false teaching. You gotta say, I don't really know how to ask this. Where do you feel like the Corinthians are on that? If Paul's concerned about that, on that slope of kind of falling away, how would you assess their danger level by reading 2 Corinthians 11? The Corinthians themselves. They're frail. Okay. What other thoughts about where they fall? Again, the question I'm asking, like 1 to 10, the risk level for the Corinthian church based on reading these chapters here. Michael, what do you think?
Well, if they have people among them who are teaching false truth, then that seems pretty high, like danger, right? You got people in your group who are tearing it apart from the inside, basically, is probably what would happen if you let it.
Yeah. Albert, what do you think?
I'm bad at analogies, but I'm thinking this has gone from somebody in the town square hollering out loud to being in people's homes talking this doctrine, and people sitting around being comfortable and discussing this from a very cerebral type mindset.
Is there evidence in 2 Corinthians that maybe the Corinthians are not as in much, not that they're not in danger, obviously, but they're maybe not as far gone as maybe other people Paul writes to, like the Galatians, for instance?
A good report from Titus.
Yeah, remember, don't forget that chapters 1 to 7 is still part of the same book. I mean, Paul was very pleased with the report he heard from Titus, and everyone, in Corinth has received Paul's message. They've repented, the picture I'm trying to paint here, at least in terms of the best we can tell, is that there is a danger, but again, I think it's outside teachers that maybe are trying to infiltrate. Albert kind of gives us a nice image here of those, from the outside, maybe finding their way in, and there's a group perhaps that's susceptible to this. But Paul is concerned that they will go from being this pure virgin belonging to Christ, and that they will be deceived like Eve was deceived in order to, fall away and be led astray by these workers of Satan. Notice verse 4. What do you think Paul means when he says in verse 4, if anyone, preaches a different Jesus, preaches a different spirit, preaches a different gospel, you bear this beautifully. What do you think Paul's getting at when he says that? What does he mean? He says, anybody coming and preaching a different gospel, you bear this beautifully, or you tolerate this, maybe is the language that Michael was. What's he saying in that verse?
Goes forward, actually. to verse 20, where he talks about them readily accepting things. And if we go back to 1 Corinthians, they were accepting a brother that was living in sin. And so there's a history of the Corinthians being accepting, and he's trying, I think, to convince them to be a little bit more discerning.
I think Lee's right on that. That Paul is saying these people come along preaching something totally different, and you're just cool with it. You're like, oh yeah, as Albert said, come sit around our table and tell us what you have to say. And Lee uses the word discerning, and they're not being discerning in that sense. And so Paul feels the need to speak up and to refute these opponents. And in doing so, he invariably has to talk about himself, which gets to our odd feature of 2 Corinthians 11. The first thing Paul talks about is what Dan pointed to in his observation, which was this thing about money. What is going on? Why does Paul have to talk about the fact that he didn't receive money from them in the middle of this kind of conflict over the false teachers that are opposing Paul, trying to pull Corinthians away? Why is Paul talking about him preaching and not receiving money from the Corinthians? Any guesses on that? So he's doing it. The reason he's doing it is for them, right? And because he's so committed to the gospel that he doesn't, let that become a stumbling block. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a second. But why bring it up? Is why? How does that fit into the conversation about this kind of tug of war over the Corinthians' hearts that Paul is engaging in with the opponents? Lee?
Well, in chapter 9, we see him talking about collecting. I mean, there's a lot of talking about money. There's the collection for the saints. And surely, I mean, the people that were criticizing Paul, well, he's only in it for the money. That's what they're... He's even raising money for other people, too. He's defending that part of it along with everything else that he's... And I think he's using hyperbole and exaggeration to show them, look, this is what's not... I mean, I'm not doing it for these reasons. I have all these reasons I could boast. In fact, he starts talking about boasting in chapter 10 and carries on through chapter 12. It's a lot of time to not be wanting to talk about yourself. Really.
Yeah. Okay, Michael, you had something else or Steve, on the money thing?
Could it have something to do with social custom of the day? Accepting money would put Paul in a position to where he would be beholding to a particular group in the way that they socially categorized people at that time. Maybe you've studied some of that. I think he had real concern for that because it would put him in a position to where he couldn't be as effective with everyone. So I don't think it was so much the fact that he wouldn't accept the money for the needs that he might have, but because of the social issues related to taking the money, he didn't want to be in that position.
So add this to the list of, we talk about the beef that the opponents have with Paul. This appears to be one of the items on the list. And it may seem strange to us, but it appears from what's being said here in chapter 11 that the fact that Paul did not accept money from the Corinthians opens him up to criticism from the opponents. Okay, and you're going to say, why in the world? We would think the opposite. We would think that if Paul did accept money, then he would be criticized. Not exactly clear what's going on exactly, but there's some ideas. One, we might understand the idea, in our terminology, we would say like the difference between a professional and an amateur, right? That if you get paid to do something, then you're like, really, that's what you do, and you're good at it. You just do it like, and don't get paid for it, then maybe you're not as good, or you wouldn't get paid, being paid for it. There could be something like that. There was professional, in a sense, or there were orators and rhetoricians that had a following and that were paid by their supporters, by their followers, and that was a big deal in this culture. And so Paul not doing that among the Corinthians for those that were obsessed with status and power and all that kind of stuff, these other teachers, they could say, look at Paul. He's not a real orator. He's not a real rhetorician. And that gets back to what Mike said earlier about his kind of, he's not the public speaker and the powerful presence that we want him to be, okay? It could also be, there's probably more information than you care to know, but there's this idea of patronage in ancient Roman custom, right? Artists would only be able to do their art because they had wealthy patrons that supported them. This may be related to what Steve is saying, that then that patron, that was an honor. The patron would pay the artist, okay, so that the artist could work, or that speaker could speak, or that teacher could teach, and then the good work of that person, right, would reflect honorably on the patron who was paying for that to happen, okay? So it could be that the opponents are saying to the Corinthians, look, he's insulting you by not letting you support him in his work, right? All right. All that is in some ways irrelevant. All we need to know is that Paul is having to say, look, no, there's a reason why I didn't accept money. I have on here a couple of slides with the passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Remember that? In 1 Corinthians, he kind of made a big deal about it. I have the right to accept money from you, but I'm not, because of the things that we've already talked about, right? Because he was in it because he was boasting in the Lord and the gospel. It's not about the money and all that kind of stuff, okay? Which reminds me, and then I'll stop talking, at least for a little bit, of what Steve said earlier. Steve said something earlier about people being fickle. And people that are opposed to the truth are just going to be opposed to the truth. And I think there's kind of an interesting example of that here with Paul, right? Paul didn't want to accept money from the Corinthians because he didn't want that to be a stumbling block in preaching the gospel. So he decided not to take money. But then because he decided not to take money, the people who were opposed to him criticized him for not taking money. Okay, it reminds me of what Jesus says about John and him, right? John came fasting, and they said he had a demon. And then Jesus came eating, and they said he's a glutton and a drunkard, right? It's like they won't be happy. People that are opposed to the truth are going to be opposed to the truth. And so you see that, I think, some here with Paul in the money situation. Anything he does, really, they're going to find a way to criticize it. But just know that this appears to be on the list of criticisms that they have against Paul. All right, let's keep going a little bit. It's been the last 4 or 5 minutes, 6 minutes or so that we have. What do we make of all the stuff Paul is saying? So he talks about, these are false apostles, they're false teachers, and they're disguising themselves as angels of light, servants of righteousness, but they're really servants of Satan. And so then the rest of the chapter, he's going to talk about himself. What do we make of all this stuff that Paul says? He says he's boasting, but he says he's talking in foolishness. And he goes on and on about all the things that he suffered, all the things that he endured. What is Paul saying with this long list of things that he's endured and things about him, biographical details? What's Paul really doing? What's his response to these deceivers in this boasting that he engages in? Yeah, Michael, what do you think?
I think your actions say a lot about you. And so he's telling about what he's done and what's happened to him, but it shows how invested he is in the gospel and in teaching it and in the church, and so I think he's probably trying to contrast with his opponents, like maybe, like what have they sacrificed for you and for Christ and for his church.
Thank you, Michael. Other thoughts? Michael says it's the actions of Paul that speak louder than any kind of resume here. Yeah,
also, they're questioning his sincerity, and the way I read it is that he's saying, if I wasn't sincere, you really think I'd have put up with all this? I had ample opportunities to go out, to get away, to not do this, but I'm so devoted to it that no matter what is thrown at me, I'm still preaching the same thing. So I think it's almost kind of an answer to their charge of insincerity on his part, that he's saying, I had plenty of opportunities to bug out on this, and I didn't.
So Mike uses the word sincerity. Remember chapter 1, verse 12, as Paul opens up, the opening message after the Thanksgiving in chapter 1 is, our proud confidence is this, the testimony of our conscience, that in holiness and in godly sincerity, not in fleshly wisdom, but in the grace of God, we have conducted ourselves in the world, and especially toward you. And the sufferings of Paul listed in chapter 11 would demonstrate that. Michael mentions, and in fact, that verse there mentions a contrast with the fleshly wisdom and the godly sincerity. Michael mentioned that the list of Paul would perhaps be a contrast. What kinds of things, I mean, we're kind of speculating, I guess, some. What kind of things do you think Paul's opponents, if they were making a list, maybe they had made a list, maybe they had come with letters of their resume and their qualifications. What do you think these false teachers would have included on their list if they were trying to make the same point as Paul? Yeah, Michael?
Probably the answer, all the questions he asks, except for maybe the last one. Are they Hebrews, Israelites, descendants of Abraham? And maybe add like great speakers, or do they know a lot, so to speak? The wisdom of earthly wisdom, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of things might we, if we, when we get caught up in the kind of mode of these false teachers in our world, what would we list on our resume? Education, the degrees, the letters after your name. What else? Yeah, number of followers, right? I mean, literally now, it's like, oh, so many followers on social media, maybe one, but, what you've accomplished in your career. Somebody here was saying this to me the other day. It's like, as men, we can't help in any conversation. You want to kind of get in there, like how you in your career, you matter, or you're accomplishing something, or you're important to the company, whatever. How much money you've made, or what your salary is. I mean, that would be our terminology. But I think that's the kind of thing we're supposed to be imagining with these false teachers. And Paul's list is almost totally opposite. But it's not quite totally opposite. And Michael pointed out some overlap. Right? Where's the overlap with Paul and the false teachers? The heritage, the Jewishness, the being from the family of Abraham. But the difference is, for the false teachers, being a Jew, being of the family of Abraham, is kind of the reason to boast and to lord it over the Gentiles and say, look, we're the original ones. You need to become like us in order to be in the kingdom. Paul uses his heritage as a Jew really to lower himself and to say that I am no different, even in my heritage. And I am, just like you, Gentiles in Corinth, saved by faith in Jesus. So that it makes that point even more powerfully, I think, that he has that same kind of credential. I think similar, not quite the same kind of passage, but a very similar point that he's making in Philippians 3, when he's kind of contrasting himself in that same way too. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day, but all things I've counted as loss for the sake of Jesus, that I might know him and the power of his resurrection. And there's a similar point being made here. So boasting not in his accomplishments, but boasting in his weakness. And that's really where we'll pick up in chapter 12. But Michael asks, why end with being led out of the city of Damascus in a basket? I have no idea. But it's definitely not the most glorious picture. I mean, sometimes we do this. We talk about our hardships, but we talk about our hardships in a way to like really show how we did this awesome thing. It's like, really like company hit rock bottom and we did terrible, but then I really turned it around. And, the picture of Paul escaping from Damascus is not a very glorious picture of his heroics. He's like a grown man in a basket being let down, in the middle of the night off of the wall. So maybe he tells that story just to kind of put one more, feather in the cap of his own weakness, highlighting that and in his service of the gospel. There's probably some more things from chapter 11 we'll want to talk about. I figured that would be the case because it's one of our longer chapters. But we'll move on to chapter 12 on Wednesday of next week and maybe tie back some things from chapter 11. Thank you guys for your contributions, as always.